My brother thought the family business was his rightful trophy, and he was more than willing to throw me under the bus to get it. He thought he'd pull it off quietly and smoothly, but my little recording of his betrayal turned his farewell party into the biggest show of the year. Watching his empire of lies crumble before everyone was priceless. Let's start from the beginning. My name's Sam, and honestly, I've always believed that in our family, trust was everything. You know, that cozy feeling of knowing that family would never turn against you. I spent most of my life helping my dad grow the family business, and when it came time to discuss its future, I didn't hesitate for a second. My parents would handle things fairly. They wanted to leave the business in capable hands, and who better than me to handle it, right? Except there was one small detail I hadn't factored in. My younger brother, Mike. He's 27, and let's just say he's never been one for hard work. Mike's the guy who always finds important things to do, just to avoid the actual work. But when there was an opportunity to shine, he'd be right there. And I'll be honest, it annoyed me. What frustrated me most was how his interest in the work was always shallow. It wasn't the business he cared about. It was how he looked in it. While I was putting in the sweat, Mike was always there for the glory moments. We'd all gotten used to it and, to be honest, didn't take it seriously. But then, when my parents announced that they planned to retire in a year and decide who'd inherit the business, what does Mike do? He suddenly starts playing responsible employee. He'd show up to the office with the face of a dedicated professional, giving orders, even glancing over the accounting records. And yes, it looked just as ridiculous as you'd imagine. I watched his whole act with a smirk, convinced he didn't even know what he was doing. At first, I laughed at this sudden change. I mean, picture it. The guy who used to barely roll out of bed was now arriving at the office early, trying to act like he knew what was going on. He even threw out a couple of ideas on how to improve strategy. Honestly, it was surreal. But the more he followed my parents around, pouring on the compliments and posturing as the dedicated son, the more uneasy I felt. At every family gathering, he'd drop lines like, "We need to preserve the family legacy. Sam and I may see things differently, but I believe in tradition." Tradition? Seriously? That's when I started to realize this loyalty act wasn't just a phase. So one evening, I happened to luckily catch an interesting conversation in Mike's office. He was standing by the window, pretending to be some business genius, phone in hand. I was about to leave, but then I heard something that made my hair stand on end. He was laughing, saying something like, "Relax, soon everything will be under my control." I froze. Under control? This guy can barely control what he has for breakfast, and now he's talking about running a whole business. At first, I thought he was just spouting off as usual, but things quickly got more interesting. Mike began bragging about how our parents always believe in his perfection, and right then, all my warning bells went off. Perfection? Who was he even talking about? I nearly laughed out loud, but held back to see where this was going. And then, he revealed his big plan. Trusting Sam with the business would be a huge mistake, he said confidently, as if he was about to drop a bombshell. I'll find a way to convince them that I'm the one they need. At first, I thought I'd misheard. You know, that feeling when you can't believe your ears? But no, I heard him clearly. This guy was openly plotting to outmaneuver me in front of our parents and leave me looking like a fool. Think I stormed into the office and called him out? Not a chance. I just stood there in the hallway, trying to wrap my head around what I'd heard. He was genuinely ready to betray me, his own brother, and cut me out of the business I'd built with my dad nearly from scratch. It wasn't just shocking, it was like a punch to the gut. Have you ever felt like someone close to you was really stabbing you in the back? That's exactly what this felt like. And honestly, the anger overwhelmed me instantly. But I pulled myself together quickly. I knew Mike was ready to go all the way with this. Now I understood this wasn't just a family disagreement. This was a serious game, and I'd have to defend not only my reputation, but also my parents' trust. After that night when I overheard Mike, I couldn't stop thinking about how far he'd go to push me out and claim the business. He was clearly plotting something, and I had to figure out what kind of game he was playing. Just getting angry and moving on? Not an option. I knew if I didn't take serious action, he'd find a way to paint me in a bad light in front of our parents, and I wouldn't even see it coming. I called my best friend Tom. We've known each other since childhood, and he understands exactly how things work in our family. Tom is the kind of guy who knows how to work a situation to his advantage and come out looking like an angel. I told him everything. How Mike suddenly decided he was Employee of the Year, his attempts to undermine me with our parents, and most importantly, his talk about convincing them I wasn't worthy of their trust. "Sam, you have to play this carefully," Tom said after I'd finished ranting. "If you go at him head on, he'll turn it back on you. Imagine you tell your parents he's out to betray them. Who knows how he'd twist it? No, you need to let the truth come out on its own so they can see him for who he really is." Honestly, I was ready to grab Mike by the collar and tell him to his face. But Tom was right. Mike was counting on that reaction. If I lost my cool, he'd easily paint me as the jealous, aggressive brother while he stayed squeaky clean. No, I needed something clever, something he couldn't wriggle out of. Then it hit me. A voice recorder. Not just a confrontation, not some pointless argument. Just record him incriminating himself. I knew he liked to stop by my office often enough, supposedly to talk, but really to gloat about his success. All I had to do was leave a recorder in the right spot, let him spill his secrets, thinking I couldn't hear. This little device would be my insurance. I decided to take my time, wait for the perfect moment when Mike would let his guard down and reveal his true plans. Now I had a plan. The next day, I bought a voice recorder, tested it out, and set it up in the least obvious place under my desk. All that was left was to wait for the right moment. I felt a thrill, like I was preparing for a game with stakes higher than ever. The plan was simple. Wait for Mike to start talking and let the recorder do the work. If he was really going to play dirty, so be it. Now I had a trump card. The day finally came when I put my plan into action. I accidentally left my office door open, just enough to make anyone think I'd forgotten to close it. Sure enough, Mike couldn't resist the opportunity. He strolled right in, wasting no time, clearly thinking luck was on his side once again. I'd already turned on the recorder, hidden it under a shelf in the corner, and went off on errands. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for him to start spilling his secrets. I'll admit, I was a bit nervous. Part of me wanted to know what he'd say, but another part was a little disturbed. I mean, I was about to listen in on my own brother. But by the time I came back that evening and listened to the recording, any doubts I had vanished. On the recording, I could hear Mike talking to a mutual acquaintance, David, who, to my surprise, was egging him on. Mike was on a roll. He started with how our parents see me as the ideal candidate. His voice practically dripped with sarcasm. He said, "They think Sam's the reliable one, like he's some saint of responsibility, but if they knew a few things, I think they'd change their minds fast." His laugh was so slimy, it made my skin crawl. But that was just the beginning. He went on, "Yeah, they believe Sam's all about the business. But what if I show them another side of him? I'll stage a couple of situations so they can see their golden boy isn't so perfect." I nearly choked hearing this. So he was planning to ruin my reputation with our parents by setting me up? He even started brainstorming examples. One of his brilliant ideas was to make it look like I was slacking off at work, pretending to be busy while actually doing nothing. By this point, my blood was boiling. Everything I heard filled me with both disappointment and rage. Mike talked about how he'd make me look like the irresponsible son, and his friend David was all for it. Yeah, better make sure. Get Sam out of their good graces. I nearly smashed the recorder listening to it. But you know what? Instead of just getting angry or upset, I felt a fierce determination. If they wanted to play dirty, fine. It was time to take decisive action. The plan was simple. Catch Mike red-handed at his own farewell party. My parents decided to host this gathering in honor of his business trip, and I immediately knew this was the perfect moment for the final act. Mike had no idea I was planning a show just for him. He was sure he'd outsmarted me, that I was completely in the dark, and that I'd soon be out of the picture for good. But I had one little surprise, a recorder loaded with his master plans and his allies' support. First, I enlisted Tom, who was thrilled to be part of this chaos. "Just say the word," he smirked, "and I'll be there to watch this genius plan crash and burn." Tom was like my secret weapon. Not just moral support, but someone who knew exactly how to back me up if anyone tried to object. I explained to him that he'd need to act totally clueless and then, at the right moment, help me play the recording so no one could deny the truth. Then, I started to build the tension. During family dinners, I'd drop hints about a small announcement that would surprise everyone. Naturally, my parents thought it would be something good, but Mike looked uneasy. He was used to being in control, and each of my surprise comments made him a little more nervous. He tried to hide it, of course, but I could see him glancing at me across the table, trying to figure out what I was up to. When the day of the party arrived, I was completely ready. The evening started off light-hearted. Guests arrived, and everyone was in a celebratory mood. Mike, as expected, was beaming like a gold medalist, utterly convinced this was his night. He was all smiles, patting people on the back, talking about how he'd soon return a changed man, ready to take over the business. Meanwhile, I chuckled to myself, picturing his reaction when the recording would start to play. The night of the party came, and Mike turned it into a full-blown show. With a smile plastered across his face, he accepted congratulations, handed out compliments, and acted like the picture of reliability and kindness. Guests, friends, and colleagues, everyone was in awe of his new beginning and serious plans. Mike was soaking up every moment. You should have seen him, standing in the center of the room, taking in the praise like he'd just won a Nobel Prize. Then, when the atmosphere was at its peak, I decided it was time. I stepped forward, raising my hand to get everyone's attention. "Sorry to interrupt," I said, putting on a conspiratorial look, "but I've got something interesting for all of you." Mike stood beside me, oblivious, assuming it would be another generic congratulations, or maybe even a toast in his honor. Poor guy, his smug smile almost made me laugh. I took out the recorder and pressed play. At first, everyone looked a bit confused, unsure of what was happening. But as soon as Mike's voice started speaking, silence fell over the room. On the recording, he brazenly explained to his buddy David how he planned to paint me as an incompetent heir and destroy my parents' trust in me. He went on about how easily he'd shatter their illusions about me, joking about how simple it was to trick our parents into believing he was the only worthy candidate. Every word he spoke was like a bomb going off. The guests listened silently. Some shook their heads, others just stood there, mouths open. Mike went pale, but he didn't lose his nerve. He stepped forward, clearly ready to stop me. He lunged, trying to grab the recorder, but I pulled it back and turned up the volume so everyone could hear until the very end. It was the perfect moment. When the recording finished, the room fell into an intense silence. Every gaze turned to Mike. Stunned, disappointed, some people whispering to each other and nodding toward my dear brother. I looked at my parents' faces, and it was a sight not for the faint-hearted. They stood there as if they'd been hit. Disappointment, anger, hurt, all of it was mixed in their eyes. Mike tried to stammer out something like an excuse, but it only made their anger stronger. This scene was the peak of my plan, and I wasn't about to let him wiggle out of it. After that night, Mike, unsurprisingly, began scrambling like a fish out of water. He probably thought he could get out of it with his usual excuses, the same ones he'd used as a kid whenever he got caught sneaking candy after dinner. Would that even work on adults? I doubt he knew, but he tried anyway. First, he went to our parents, making excuses. It was just a misunderstanding. Sam went overboard trying to protect his reputation. Oh yes, classic Mike, the master of shifting blame. He knew full well that his performance was worthless, but he desperately tried to convince everyone it was some silly mistake. My parents looked at him with that expression that usually means, "We expected better, but you've really let us down." Mike's attempts to explain himself were pitiful. He stammered on like a 5-year-old caught red-handed. My parents stood there listening in silence, but their faces showed that they weren't buying his whole corrupted recording, misunderstanding, and brotherly miscommunication act. My father looked at him with a mix of disappointment and exhaustion, as though he was aging before my eyes. Mom just stood aside, her eyes downcast, as if she couldn't even bear to look at him. When he finally finished his excuses, there was a dreadful pause, and in that silence, it became clear that no one was going to defend him. Realizing his parents wouldn't take his side, Mike tried to turn to his friends who'd been at the party. He called everyone he knew, complaining about how everything went wrong, hoping someone would have his back. But everyone knew what he'd tried to do for his own gain. And you know what? They all just stopped answering his calls. His buddies, the ones who'd smiled at him like close friends just the day before, simply vanished. No one wanted to associate with someone willing to go against his own family for personal gain. And as for me, honestly, watching him squirm felt strange. On one hand, it was a little sad to see him struggling like that, but on the other, it was the truth he'd been so afraid of. Mike had always been a master manipulator, and now he was finally facing the consequences. My parents made a final announcement. They would no longer consider him a candidate to take over the business. After all that happened, my parents finally made the announcement. The business goes to Sam. They said it calmly, without much emotion, but their looks made it clear that this was more than just a decision. It was the end of any hope for someone who was once a part of our family, but managed to lose everything to greed and deception. I stood beside them, unable to hide a slight smirk, not because I was celebrating his downfall, but because I knew justice had been served. Mike gathered his things and left without a word. No goodbyes, no apologies, not a single attempt to defend himself. He just left the house, like a ghost who'd held on to something that never really belonged to him. I think he realized he'd lost his last connection to his family and understood that he had no future here. From the moment of the exposure to this very minute, he'd kept his distance, avoiding everyone. He didn't even try to mend things, knowing that bridge was burned and there was no going back. To be honest, I felt a strange sense of relief after it was all over. Yes, it was hard, seeing your own brother willing to betray you for his own gain, but in the end, I realized this person had never truly been part of what we'd built. Mike wanted the family business as a trophy, not as something of value, not as something we'd poured our time and effort into. Now that this whole soap opera was finally over, I could get back to work. No more schemes, no dark secrets, just work and the peace of knowing no one would stab me in the back. Our family was finally free of false illusions, and I felt liberated.